Watching the news on a nightly basis, sometimes you see a story where two leaders of a country meet and they shake hands, but it leaves you with the question, hey, what was that all about? Well, the story was between the United States Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and China's Premier Xi Jinping in Beijing. Hello, I'm Mike Bain from Christian Voice in New Zealand. In a moment, let me tell you why this story has alarm bells ringing. You know, there's no doubt in my mind that we are living in a time eschatologists call the last days. Ever since the death of Jesus, we've been living in that time, but the answer Jesus gave to the questioning apostles, how will we know, in what we now call the Olivet Discourse. Jesus' response was a compilation of events which would happen in a generational time. Without a doubt, we are seeing a convergence of those events in our time. That's why when a meeting between the US Secretary of State and the Chinese President, given the two are trading partners, is normally something which wouldn't raise an eyebrow, but suddenly starts to look ominous. Let me tell you, this was no ordinary meeting between the two superpowers. It may have escaped your attention simply because we hardly see a lot of international news from our media, who are more interested in how many sausage rolls Chippy can eat in a sitting with the king. But not long ago, we at Christian Voice New Zealand brought you a reason why we felt the world is heading towards another war on a global scale. And now with some urgency, we're following up. Now, it's not our intention to have you watch this and be fearful. It's more for your information, as we don't want anyone to be caught unaware. Shortly before setting out for Beijing, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who is the highest-ranking member of the Biden administration, emphasized the importance of the US and China establishing better lines of communication. The US wants to make sure, and I quote Blinken, that the competition we have with China doesn't veer into a conflict due to avoidable misunderstandings. Now, following the June 16 NATO defence ministers meeting in Brussels just a day before the meeting between Blinken and Jinping, US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin told reporters it was important for the two countries to talk to each other so they could manage potential crises and make sure, quote, things aren't allowed to unnecessarily spiral out of control. What could possibly go wrong? Well, if you've been up with the news, you'll know all is not as well at the international playground. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made reunification with Taiwan one of his most important foreign policy goals. Now, if he's able to pull it off, he'd be a national hero in China. But there's a huge problem standing in his way. The moment that China invades Taiwan, a war with the United States will begin. Xi Jinping understands this very well, and so if an invasion of Taiwan is going to happen, it must take place at a moment that's favourable to the Chinese. Military experts argue that the window of opportunity for China to act is open now, and will remain open for the next 18 months. Today, the US and other Western nations are pouring vast amounts of military resources into the conflict in the Ukraine. As a result, they're ill-prepared to militarily confront a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. In addition, Xi Jinping knows that Joe Biden won't use nuclear weapons if the Chinese move against Taiwan. Thus, it would be a conventional war, and such a scenario would greatly favour China. But if the Chinese wait until after the next presidential election in the United States, it could be Donald Trump or another Republican could well be in the White House, and the risk of sparking a nuclear conflict would go up substantially. So the clock is ticking for the Chinese leader. Recent statements made by Jinping certainly suggest his intentions are to get China prepared for a coming war with the United States. Now, here's an excerpt from the Wall Street Journal. He says, at a top-level meeting focused on national security on May 30, the Chinese leader said, we must be prepared for worst-case and extreme scenarios and be ready to withstand the major test of high winds, choppy waters and extreme, even dangerous storms. The foreign policy experts that the Journal interviewed for their story clearly understood that Xi was referring to war. And the only reason the Chinese would be fighting a major war at any time soon is if they launched an invasion of Taiwan. Now, over the past week, China has continued to send large numbers of military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense zone. Recent reports show that Taiwan's Air Force scrambled into action after spotting 10 Chinese warplanes crossing the sensitive median line of the Taiwan Strait, as the island's defense ministry said 4 Chinese warships also carried out combat patrols. It was the second time in less than a week that Taiwan has reported renewed Chinese military activity after 37 Chinese military aircraft recently flew into the island's air defense zone, some of which then flew into the Western Pacific. So why are they doing this? They're probing Taiwan's defences. They're looking for weak spots. They're testing to see how the Taiwanese would respond to certain scenarios. But every time the Chinese send planes and ships toward Taiwan, it only makes tensions in the region even worse. Not helping, of course, is the US by sending more troops to the island. In February, Taiwan's president said American and Taiwan military forces will cooperate even more closely and plan to bolster military exchanges. At the time, CNN reported that between 20 and 40 American Marines were routinely based on the island, largely for security operations around America's unofficial diplomatic outposts. But Taiwan News reported America had increased its presence to about 200 troops. Watching from afar, we see the same pattern of military build-up from China is repeating exactly what happened just before the Russians invaded Ukraine. Now, the Biden administration just keeps taking steps, though, to aggravate China, and the Chinese just keep taking steps to aggravate the Biden administration. Fair to say, if the US continues, at some point the Chinese are going to be pushed over the edge. Well, are we almost there now? A major British news source is telling us that the Biden administration has been developing plans for the evacuation of Americans living in Taiwan. According to the website themessenger.com, a senior US intelligence person who spoke on the condition of anonymity because basically they're not authorised to disclose the strategy, reported that this evacuation planning has been ongoing for at least 6 months and has significantly increased over the last few months. So, if an evacuation happens, that'll be a very clear sign that war is imminent. So let's just hope that an evacuation doesn't happen anytime soon. But if a war with China does erupt, many Americans will assume that the US will win. But the truth is that literally dozens of war games that the US have conducted in recent years have all shown the United States would lose such a conflict. CNN reports.
The war game assesses that the U.S. loses 10 to 20 combat ships, including 2 aircraft carriers, and 200 to 400 military aircraft. In 3 weeks of fighting, the U.S. suffers more than 3,000 troops killed in action. That's about half of what the U.S. suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan over 2 decades. America's global position is damaged for years. China loses 90% of its amphibious fleet and 52 major surface warships, and its Air Force loses more than 160 combat aircraft. Crucial to this outcome is the stockpile of precision-guided munitions. Taiwan would need more U.S.-supplied Harpoon anti-ship missiles, which may be in short supply because these missiles have been sent to Ukraine. The U.S. needs its own long-range anti-ship missiles, and this supply is one of the big risks.
It runs out within typically the first couple of days, and when that runs out, then the United States has to use shorter range munitions. Those can be effective, but it increases losses and increases risk.
So once China invades Taiwan, the United States will be at war with the Chinese. If the war doesn't go nuclear, the Chinese know that they would have the advantage. But Joe Biden is not going to start lobbing nukes at the Chinese mainland to keep them out of Taiwan. That just isn't going to happen. So there it is. A window of opportunity for the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, to do something he desperately wants to do. But will he do it? The recent meeting between Blinken and Jinping last week would indicate it's close. It really appears likely that until the next presidential election in the United States, China has a chance to grab Taiwan. But for all our sakes, let's hope that Jinping chooses not to go down that route. But here's the question. If a conflict, and when a conflict happens, where does that leave New Zealand? Time and time again, I've mentioned in previous discourses, we'll have to make a choice. Given the scenarios the United States may lose, which means that they could possibly lose influence in the Pacific, it now puts New Zealand in a very precarious spot. Well, what's this really got to do with you and me? Well, when you read through the book of Revelation and the War of Armageddon, there's no mention, no hint of the United States' involvement in that war. We're seeing Bible prophecy unfolding daily. Not only did Jesus give his disciples a sign of the times when this would happen, he also implored them to stay on the watch. Let me leave you, though, with these words from Matthew 24:38. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving into marriage, up to the day that Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That's how it will be with the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of a house had known at what time the thief was coming, he would have kept watch, and he would not have left his house be broken into. So you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. I mentioned earlier, we're watching a piece of the end times jigsaw being put in place, and the picture that Jesus painted in his Olivet Discourse is really starting to take shape. So all I can say is stay on the watch.